In the autumn twilight, as dusk approached, Maggie let out a deep sigh in the driver's seat. Through the car window stood her son Oliver's special needs school. The schoolyard was silent after classes, and the yellow-tinged leaves swayed in the cold wind. Several leaves danced down, quietly accumulating on the empty slide. "Mom, let's go home," came a small voice from the passenger seat. Oliver didn't look up from his number puzzle, his fingers moving with intense concentration. His small back in the light blue sweater leaned slightly forward whenever he focused. Maggie smiled gently. "Yes, you did well today." As she started the engine, Maggie remembered her husband's face. After losing him in a sudden accident 3 years ago, she had to shoulder all responsibilities alone. At 34, as a project manager at an IT consulting firm, she juggled work and childcare daily. She woke up at 6 a.m. to get Oliver ready and drive him to his special needs school. Her days were filled with online meetings and face-to-face consultations, and in the evenings, she accompanied her son to therapy sessions. Still, supported by Oliver's innocent smile, she had somehow managed to carry on. In the back seat, Oliver counted numbers in a soft voice. His thin finger carefully traced each number written on the whiteboard. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, her 5-year-old son particularly loved numbers and puzzles. Though he spoke little, he could express his love to family members. That was Maggie's most precious treasure. "Oliver, would you like a snack?" When the car stopped at a red light, Maggie pulled out a small cookie from her bag. Oliver nodded silently, put down his puzzle, and reached out. There was a certain rhythm to his movements. Maggie watched each gesture with loving eyes. The car entered a quiet residential area. Her mother Dorothy's house stood in an affluent suburban neighborhood. Among the neatly lined maple trees, a large cream-colored house came into view. Her mother had started living alone there after retiring as a high school teacher. While she played the role of a seemingly calm and understanding grandmother on the surface, Maggie knew better. She recognized the strict values lurking within her mother and her inability to accept anything that wasn't normal. On weekends, Dorothy would look after Oliver. However, behind her cooperative attitude, Maggie hadn't missed the bewildered expressions at her grandson's abnormal behavior. The way she watched Oliver repeatedly arrange the same objects, her frowning at sudden loud noises, her confusion at her grandson's insistence on following set routines. Still, this time, she had no choice but to rely on her mother. "Maggie, this is an important opportunity for you," Dorothy had said on the phone yesterday. "A week-long business trip to New York. A crucial project that could lead to a promotion." With no other childcare options available, asking her mother was unavoidable. Her mother, who had initially hesitated, surprisingly agreed without resistance. "Leave it to me." Despite feeling uneasy about those words, Maggie had no alternative. Though she sensed something off about her mother's tone, she had to suppress that feeling of discomfort. And now, on the night before her trip, in Dorothy's living room, Oliver showed his grandmother an innocent smile. In the warm lighting, the little boy's smile shone brightly. "I love you, Grandma." At those pure words, Dorothy's expression became complex. The smile on her lips and something lurking in her eyes created a discordant note. Seeing this, an indescribable anxiety spread through Maggie's chest. But there was no turning back now. Tomorrow's first morning flight. Maggie hugged her son tightly and gave her mother final instructions. Oliver's preferences and habits, and emergency contacts. As she handed over detailed notes, she felt an unavoidable pain in her chest. The night wind caressed her cheeks coldly. As she left, looking back, Dorothy and Oliver stood at the entrance. In the twilight, their figures appeared fleeting, like an old photograph. Oliver waved his small hand. At that gesture, tears welled up in Maggie's eyes. On a chilly, rainy autumn evening, Maggie's car pulled up in front of Dorothy's house. She had returned a day earlier than planned. Her presentation in New York had been successful, and the final day's meeting was suddenly cancelled. Though she should have been celebrating achieving her goal of promotion, such things now seemed trivial. Walking quickly over wet fallen leaves, Maggie felt her heart pounding. For a week, there hadn't been a single phone call from her mother. Messages were met with only terse "everything's fine" responses. When she asked to hear Oliver's voice on the phone, she was always told he's sleeping. Each time, she had fought against the anxiety that gripped her chest. The sky hung dark and low, fine rain hitting her face. The maple trees swayed in the wind, casting ominous shadows on the ground. As she approached the entrance, her anxiety grew. Oliver's voice, which should have been audible by now, was missing. Her son always played the same activities at set times. At this hour, he should definitely be absorbed in puzzles in the living room. Yet there was no sound of him counting numbers or arranging puzzle pieces. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. The sound of the lock opening echoed unnaturally loud. An unnatural silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of rain. "I'm home." Opening the entrance, she saw the living room bathed in warm lighting. Coffee aroma wafted through the air, and Dorothy was relaxing on the sofa. Dressed in an elegant tweed suit, her mother maintained a graceful posture as if waiting for guests. An open gardening magazine lay on her lap, and an expensive bone china cup sat on the table. This everyday scene made the house's abnormal silence even more striking. "Oh, Maggie. You're back early." Dorothy showed no surprise as she slowly took a sip of coffee. There was something deliberately calm about her gesture. Her perfectly styled hair, carefully selected outfit, everything was as usual about her mother's appearance. Yet within that perfection, something bordering on madness lurked. "Mom, where's Oliver?" Maggie's voice trembled slightly. Was there still trust in her mother remaining, or was it reluctance to acknowledge the worst? After her question, a heavy silence fell. Only the clock's ticking echoed unnaturally loud. Dorothy carefully placed her coffee cup on the saucer. The sound of cup touching saucer pierced the air like a needle. Then she looked straight at Maggie. In her eyes dwelled determination and something resembling madness. Her lipsticked lips twisted slightly. "He's gone." A matter-of-fact tone. An expression showing not a fragment of emotion. The lightness as if discussing the weather. "I sent that autistic garbage to a facility." Those words exploded in Maggie's mind. Blood drained from her face. Her limbs turned ice cold. She couldn't breathe. Her vision began to darken. Her body creaked as she leaned against the wall. What are you saying?" Her voice was hoarse. Confusion that couldn't accept reality took over Maggie's entire body. The voice coming from her throat sounded like someone else's. "It's for your own good, Maggie." Dorothy stood up and elegantly brushed back her hair. That gesture broke something inside Maggie. The pearl necklace her mother wore, a precious gift from her father. Those pearls now looked like snake scales. "We have to think about our reputation. What would the neighbors think? Where is Oliver?" A scream echoed throughout the room. Maggie grabbed her mother's shoulders and shook her desperately. Dorothy's perfect hairstyle crumbled, and the madness hidden in her face slowly seeped to the surface. "Calm down." Dorothy maintained her composure as she brushed off Maggie's hands. The touch of those hands was ice cold. "He's receiving proper treatment at a special facility." This was the best solution. If you think about him, it was the obvious choice. Treatment. Solution. Oliver isn't sick. You're the one who needs treatment. Anger and fear swirled inside Maggie. She took out her smartphone to call the police. But her trembling fingers couldn't operate the screen properly. Tears falling on the screen disrupted the touch panel's response. To have such a defective child in our family line. Dorothy's voice was cold as ice. Her eyes seemed to be looking somewhere far away. That child should receive proper treatment and become a normal child. You're too lenient. At this rate, his future will be ruined. Mom, you. Words failed her. Hot tears spilled from Maggie's eyes. Was this reality? Was this her mother? Everything felt like a nightmare. The sound of rain hitting the windows further stirred Maggie's confused heart. "Tell me where the facility is," Maggie said through clenched teeth. Dorothy's expression clouded for a moment at the anger in her voice. "It's useless. For his sake, visits are prohibited for a while. This is a treatment plan approved by doctors. Tell me." Maggie's scream shook the house. At that voice, Dorothy's expression crumbled for a moment. A slight crack appeared in the mask of perfection. Then, with a sigh, she began writing an address on a memo pad. Her hand showed a slight tremor as she wrote. "It's pointless anyway. That facility." There was no time to listen to the end. Maggie grabbed the memo and ran towards the entrance. Her trembling hands dropped and retrieved the keys. She jumped into her car in the rain. Dorothy's figure in the rearview mirror looked somehow hollow, like a doll. Her mother's form gradually blurred behind the luxurious curtains. The torn family bonds flowed away with the autumn rain. As she started the engine, Maggie prayed desperately. In the heavy rain that obscured her vision, Maggie's car continued driving towards the suburbs. Gripping the steering wheel desperately on unfamiliar roads, guided by the address written on the memo. The sound of wipers clearing the rain echoed like heartbeats. Children's Minnesota Specialty Facility. Seeing that name, an icy lump dropped in Maggie's chest. A suspicious facility masquerading as a real children's medical institution. Could her mother have really taken Oliver to such a place? A large iron gate appeared. An old red brick building showed its intimidating form in the darkness. The seemingly well-maintained garden revealed weeds upon closer inspection. Security cameras were installed at unnatural angles, as if monitoring prisoners. "Please, I need to see my son." Her shout toward the intercom was half drowned by the rain. After a moment of silence, an impersonal female voice responded. "Visiting hours are over. I'm Margaret Stevens. Please let me see my son. Oliver Stevens." She announced her name in a trembling voice. Another silence. Then a different voice flowed from the intercom. "Mrs. Stevens, please wait." The sound of the heavy iron gate slowly opening. Its creaking sound further intensified Maggie's anxiety. A middle-aged man waited at the facility's entrance. The nameplate read, "Facility Director Mr. Thompson." He appeared to be in his mid-50s, wearing a suit under his white coat. Beside him stood a female staff member who looked to be in her 30s. Her name tag simply read, Sarah. Mrs. Stevens, this sudden visit. My son. Where's my Oliver? Maggie cut off his words and demanded. Mr. Thompson's expression clouded for a moment as he exchanged glances with Sarah. Yes, we did receive him from your mother, but... My mother. Dorothy Wilson. She has no authority to place him here. I am my son's sole legal guardian. Maggie opened her trembling hands to her bag and pulled out her ID and custody documents. She desperately spread out the rain-dampened papers. Please look at these. I have legal rights. My mother, she has no authority at all. Mr. Thompson reviewed the documents and again exchanged glances with Sarah. Their expressions gradually changed. Mrs. Stevens, actually. Sarah began speaking. Her voice carried a human warmth different from the previous administrative responses. We thought something was odd too. The admission procedures were different from usual. Please, let me see my son. Maggie's voice was hoarse. Perhaps their hearts were moved by her desperate plea. I'll take you to him. Mr. Thompson led the way. As they proceeded down the long corridor, Maggie heard a faint sound. Someone counting numbers in a small voice. She recognized that voice. Oliver. She ran toward the voice. She didn't even hear Mr. Thompson trying to stop her. Turning down the hallway, she stopped in front of a small room. Oliver's voice could definitely be heard through the door. Maggie grabbed the doorknob with trembling hands. Inside the room, Oliver sat alone at a small desk by the window. As usual, he was facing his number puzzle. However, his appearance was clearly exhausted. One could tell at a glance that he hadn't slept much for 3 days. Oliver. Hearing Maggie's voice, Oliver slowly turned around. His eyes were moist with tears. Mama. Whispering in a small voice, Oliver slowly stood up. Then he suddenly started running. Maggie knelt and embraced her son as he ran to her. His small body was trembling. Warm tears soaked Maggie's clothes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Apologizing repeatedly, Maggie held her son tightly. She buried her face in Oliver's hair, deeply inhaling his scent. Mama, let's go home. Oliver said in a thin voice. At those words, everyone in the room had tears in their eyes. Of course. Let's go home right away. As she stood up, Maggie looked at Mr. Thompson. I'll have the papers prepared. The facility director answered immediately and gave instructions to Sarah. Then he turned to Maggie and added. Mrs. Stevens, this is clearly illegal. I recommend reporting this to the police and taking legal action. Sarah returned. In her hands were a disc containing security camera footage and copies of the admission documents. These will serve as evidence. We'll also provide testimony. Maggie nodded quietly. While holding Oliver's hand tightly, she made a vow in her heart. Mom, you will pay for this. But for now. Oliver, let's go home. Holding her son's hand, they left the facility. The rain had already stopped. Through breaks in the black clouds, faint sunset light filtered through. On their way to the parking lot, Oliver suddenly stopped. Looking back, she saw her son gazing up at the sky. Pretty. He whispered in a small voice. A faint rainbow arched across the rain-cleared sky. Maggie embraced her son again. Yes, it's very pretty. The emotional wounds inflicted by her mother wouldn't heal easily. However, what mattered most now was that she had protected this small life. As they got into the car, Maggie looked up at the sky. Tomorrow's battle would surely be long and difficult. But with this child. Oliver began counting numbers again in the back seat. That voice warmly resonated in Maggie's heart. In the cold autumn breeze blowing through the courthouse hallway, Maggie let out a deep sigh. Her lawyer, Patricia Miller, was making final checks on thick stacks of documents. 30 minutes until the hearing. Oliver was waiting in the waiting room with trusted staff from a support facility. Everything is ready, Patricia quietly announced. The 45-year-old female lawyer had earned high acclaim in the field of child welfare. Upon hearing about this case, she had immediately offered her assistance. The heavy courtroom doors opened. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Just then, she saw Dorothy's figure at the far end of the hallway. Her mother, dressed in an expensive suit with perfect makeup, was still beautiful and dignified today. However, her eyes were clearly tired. Entering the courtroom, a heavy atmosphere enveloped them both. The judge took his seat and proceedings began. Evidence was presented one after another. The facility's security camera footage. Documents showing fraudulent admission procedures. Facility staff testimony. And the record of Oliver's 3 days. Defendant, Dorothy Wilson. The judge's voice echoed. Dorothy slowly stood up. Her figure no longer showed its former dignity. Your actions constitute a serious human rights violation. Why did you take such actions? A moment of silence. Then, unexpected words flowed from Dorothy's mouth. I was wrong. Her voice no longer carried its usual arrogance. It trembled. In my childhood. Dorothy stumbled over her words. Taking a deep breath, she began speaking again. My sister was born with severe disabilities. My parents placed her in a facility and tried to hide her existence. Being normal was everything. If you weren't normal, you weren't worthy of love. The courtroom fell silent. Maggie found herself staring at her mother. She had never heard this story before. Even after becoming a teacher, I continued to demand normalcy. I demanded perfection from my students and couldn't accept differences. And then, I directed the same cruelty toward my grandson. Dorothy's voice trembled. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But after placing him in the facility, I had nightmares every night. My sister's face overlapped with Oliver's. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. Oliver came running in. Before the staff could stop him, he was standing in front of his grandmother. Grandma, don't cry. His innocent voice echoed through the courtroom. Dorothy looked at her grandson's face and collapsed to the floor. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oliver timidly approached his grandmother and extended his small hand. I love you, Grandma. Those words transformed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Dorothy embraced her grandson and broke into loud sobs. The dam holding back years of emotion burst all at once. I'm truly, truly sorry. Maggie was speechless at the scene before her. She could feel the hatred and anger that had hardened in her heart slowly melting away. The sentence was suspended with probation. The conditions included regular counseling and compensation. Supervised visitation was permitted. As they left the courtroom, Dorothy bowed deeply before Maggie. Maggie, I can't ask for forgiveness. But I want to change. I want to become Oliver's real grandmother. Maggie remained silent for a long time. Then, slowly, she spoke. It will take time. But Oliver loves you. In the hallway where autumn's sunlight streamed in, mother and daughter stood in silence. The road to healing had only just begun. However, a small ray of hope was definitely visible. Hey, Mom, Oliver tugged at Maggie's sleeve. Can we go to the park with Grandma? After considering this innocent request for a moment, Maggie answered. Yes. But let's all go together. The three of them left the courthouse. They began walking slowly down the tree-lined street where leaves were beginning to turn. 1 year later. Golden maple trees colored the Minnesota suburbs. In the conference room of an autism support center, Dorothy quietly began speaking before newly joined families. I committed a grave mistake. I tried to put my grandson, my beloved grandson, in a facility. Her voice no longer carried its former arrogance. After a year of psychological counseling and self-reflection, she had definitely changed. Her flashy appearance had become more modest, and humility dwelled in her expression. But that mistake opened my eyes. Autism isn't a disease to be cured. It's an important characteristic that child was born with. Various expressions showed on the faces of families seated in the venue. Young mothers carrying anxiety. Confused fathers. Bewildered grandparents. Dorothy saw her former self in each of them. How foolish I was to demand perfection. What's important is accepting and understanding things as they are. After the lecture, a mother approached her. I can't get my mother to understand. What should I? Dorothy smiled gently. Let's think about it together. You're not alone. From the support center's window, she could see the park. There, Maggie was watching Oliver play. Her 6-year-old son was playing in the sandbox with new friends. He carefully put sand into cups while counting. A little girl peered curiously at what he was doing. What are you doing? A perfect castle needs exactly 10 scoops of sand. Oliver explained with a serious expression. The girl thought for a moment, then said, Then I'll help. The two began scooping sand together. Watching this scene, Maggie whispered in her heart. I never thought a day like this would come. Back at the support center, Dorothy watched this scene through the window. Tears glistened in her eyes. Wonderful progress. A voice came from behind. Turning around, she saw Jennifer, Oliver's therapist. Yes. But I still have so much to learn. Your transformation is giving hope to many families. Indeed, Dorothy's experience sharing at support groups had created significant resonance. Her story of confession and transformation was touching the hearts of families struggling with similar concerns. They had begun spending more time together on holidays. Today, too, they planned to visit the nearby park in the afternoon. Grandma. Oliver waved from the sandbox. Dorothy waved back slightly. On the park bench, Maggie offered her coffee. Mom, how was it? Today's lecture. Yes, it gave me a lot to think about. Mother and daughter exchanged words in the gentle autumn sunlight. The tension and wariness of the past hadn't completely disappeared. However, genuine trust had sprouted between them. You know, Maggie, Dorothy said, gazing into the distance. I'm looking for the facility where my sister is. Maggie looked at her mother in surprise. I haven't seen her for over 40 years. But I've decided to stop running away. Maggie nodded quietly at those words. Something was definitely beginning to change within her mother. Oliver proudly pointed to his completed sand castle. The sight of him laughing happily with his new friend. Mother and daughter watching over him. This scene would have been unimaginable a year ago. Hey, Mom, Oliver came running over and whispered in Maggie's ear. Grandma's smile is really pretty. At those words, Maggie and Dorothy's eyes met. Warm tears welled up in both their eyes. As evening approached, the sky began turning crimson. Maple leaves swayed in the gentle breeze. Oliver began walking, holding both his mother's and grandmother's hands. Next time, can we make cake at Grandma's house? Dorothy smiled gently at that innocent suggestion. Yes, that would be lovely. Next time, let's make a cake with Oliver's favorite numbers. Their 3 shadows stretched long behind them. They reflected the shape of a new kind of family. Wounded bonds were healing, slowly but surely. As they left the park, Oliver pointed at the sky. Look! Clouds illuminated by the setting sun spread like wings. It's beautiful. Yes, it really is beautiful. Mother and daughter's voices overlapped. In that moment, they felt their 3 hearts surely connected. As if a new door had opened.